The thunder cracked overhead as Pearl Taylor clung desperately to the fraying rope bridge spanning Deadman's Gorge, her knuckles white with strain and fear coursing through her veins like wildfire. It was supposed to be a simple crossing to deliver medicine to the old widow Lawson on the other side of the canyon, not a fight for her very life as the ancient hemp fibers weakened by years of harsh Utah weather began to give way beneath her weight. The year was 1878, and Park City, Utah was booming with silver mining prosperity. The once tiny settlement had exploded into a bustling frontier town practically overnight when the silver veins were discovered in the nearby mountains. Yet for all its newfound wealth, the town still relied on primitive infrastructure like this decrepit rope bridge that connected the main settlement to the scattered homesteads beyond the canyon. Pearl had lived in Park City her entire 23 years, watching it transform from a cluster of tents into a proper town with wooden buildings, a general store, and even a small school where she taught the miners' children. Her father had been among the first to stake a claim in the area, and though he'd passed 3 winters prior, she had stayed on, determined to make a life for herself through honest work rather than marry the first man who offered security. "Hold on." A deep voice shouted from the far side of the gorge where she'd been heading. Pearl could barely make out the figure of a man rushing toward the bridge through her terror-blurred vision. "Don't move." The advice was unnecessary. Pearl wouldn't have dared shift an inch as the wooden slats beneath her feet groaned ominously. The bridge had been sturdy enough when she'd started across, but halfway through, an explosive crack of thunder had startled her, causing her to stumble. That's when she'd heard the first snapping sound of rope fibers giving way. "I'm trying," she called back, her voice thin with fear as the wind whipped her chestnut hair across her face. The medicine bag she carried was still slung across her body, making her slightly off balance as she tried to maintain her position. The man was moving carefully but quickly onto the bridge from the opposite side, his movements practiced and deliberate. Pearl could see now that he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the practical garb of a cowboy, dusty denims, worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that somehow stayed on despite the gusting wind. "Just stay still, miss," he called, his voice steady and reassuring despite the precarious situation. "I'm coming to you," Pearl nodded, not trusting her voice anymore as the bridge swayed dangerously beneath them. The gorge below was at least 100 feet deep, with jagged rocks and the thin ribbon of a stream at the bottom. It would mean certain death if she fell. She watched as the stranger made his way toward her, testing each wooden slat before putting his full weight on it. He was just 10 feet away when another crack of thunder boomed overhead, startling a nearby murder of crows into flight. Their sudden movement and cawing caused Pearl to flinch involuntarily, and that's when it happened. With a sickening sound of fibers tearing apart, the rope on her right side snapped completely. The bridge lurched violently, tilting sideways, and Pearl was thrown off her feet. Her scream pierced the air as she slid toward the edge, fingers scrabbling desperately for purchase on the smooth wooden slats. "No!" the cowboy shouted, lunging forward with reckless speed. Pearl felt herself sliding over the edge, her legs dangling in open air as she clung to a single wooden slat with both hands. The medicine bag swung wildly beneath her, its weight threatening to pull her down completely. Her arms burned with the strain of holding her entire body weight, and she knew she couldn't maintain her grip for more than a few seconds. "Hold on." The man was suddenly above her, his face a picture of determination as he braced himself against the remaining ropes of the bridge. Without hesitation, he reached down. Just as her fingers began to slip, the cowboy grabbed her wrist in a grip like iron. Pearl felt the solid strength of his hand around her wrist, just as her other hand lost its tenuous hold on the bridge. "I've got you," he assured her, his voice strained but confident as he began to pull. Pearl looked up into the face of her savior, a man she'd never seen before, with intense green eyes and a strong, square jaw shadowed with stubble. Despite the life-or-death situation, she found herself momentarily transfixed by those eyes, which seemed to hold both concern and absolute certainty. With a powerful heave, he pulled her upward, his muscles visibly straining beneath his shirt. Pearl used her free hand to grasp his forearm, helping as much as she could until she was high enough to get her elbow over the edge of the bridge. "That's it," he encouraged, shifting his grip to get both hands under her arms. "Almost there." With one final pull, he hauled her back onto what remained of the bridge, immediately wrapping a protective arm around her waist to stabilize them both on the wildly swinging structure. "We need to move," he said urgently. "This whole thing could go any second." Pearl nodded, still too shaken to speak properly. The stranger kept his arm firmly around her waist as they began the treacherous journey to the side she'd been heading toward, which was closer. Every step was a gamble, the bridge creaking and swinging beneath their combined weight. The remaining ropes groaned under the strain, threatening to snap at any moment. When they finally reached solid ground, Pearl's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the earth, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. The cowboy crouched beside her, his face etched with concern. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. Pearl shook her head, trying to find her voice. "No, just shaken." She looked up at him, gratitude overwhelming her. "You saved my life." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett North," he replied, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with a slight wave to it. Up close, Pearl guessed him to be about 28, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun. "And you are?" "Pearl Taylor," she managed, her breathing finally beginning to normalize. "I teach at the school in Park City." Garrett nodded, his eyes darting back to the damaged bridge. "Well, Miss Taylor, I'd say that bridge has seen its last crossing." "What in heaven's name were you doing trying to cross it alone, especially with a storm brewing?" Pearl followed his gaze to the now completely collapsed bridge, the remains dangling into the gorge like broken spider webs. The reality of how close she'd come to death hit her anew, and she shuddered. "Widow Lawson's son came into town this morning saying his mother had taken ill with fever," she explained, gesturing to the medicine bag still miraculously slung across her body. "The doctor was away delivering a baby at the Henderson Ranch, and I offered to bring her medicine. I've crossed that bridge 100 times. Not in a storm like this, I'd wager," Garrett said, but his tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on. We should get to shelter before this weather worsens. My horse is tethered just up the trail." Pearl accepted his hand, noticing how her own disappeared completely in his larger one. As he helped her to her feet, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. "This way," Garrett urged, keeping hold of her hand as he led her up a narrow trail toward a stand of pine trees. By the time they reached his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion sheltered beneath the trees. They were both soaked to the skin. The rain was coming down in sheets now, rendering the landscape around them into a blur of gray and green. "Widow Lawson's place is still a mile from here," Pearl said, raising her voice to be heard above the storm. "We need to get the medicine to her." Garrett studied her face for a moment, seeming to weigh her determination against the dangers of continuing in such weather. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we'll ride together. Jupiter here is sure-footed, even in weather like this. He helped Pearl mount the horse before swinging up behind her, his arms creating a secure barrier on either side of her as he took the reins. Pearl was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, the warmth of him somehow penetrating the cold dampness of her clothes. "Hold tight," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse forward into the driving rain. The journey to Widow Lawson's small cabin seemed interminable through the storm, but Jupiter proved as sure-footed as Garrett had claimed, picking his way carefully along the muddy trail. When the small log cabin finally came into view, smoke curling defiantly from its chimney despite the rain, Pearl felt a profound sense of relief. Jacob Lawson, the widow's 15-year-old son, burst from the cabin door as they approached, his young face creased with worry. "Miss Taylor." "Ma's been asking for you," he called, then stopped short at the sight of the stranger behind her. "Who's this, Mr. North?" Pearl explained as Garrett helped her dismount. "The bridge collapsed as I was crossing. He saved my life." Jacob's eyes widened. "The bridge is gone. But how will we get to town now?" "That's a worry for another day," Garrett said practically. "Right now, let's see to your mother." Inside the modest cabin, Widow Lawson lay on a small bed in the corner, her face flushed with fever. Pearl immediately set to work, mixing the medicines the doctor had sent while Garrett helped Jacob bring in more firewood to combat the chill that had settled in the cabin. As Pearl tended to the sick woman, she was aware of Garrett moving efficiently around the small space, making himself useful without being asked. He seemed to instinctively understand what needed doing, banking the fire, finding a pot to heat water, even locating a blanket to drape around Pearl's shoulders when he noticed her shivering in her damp clothes. "You're good at this," she observed when he handed her a cup of hot tea he'd brewed. Garrett shrugged, a half-smile touching his lips. "Spent a lot of time on the trail. You learn to make yourself useful or you don't last long." "Are you passing through?" Pearl asked, suddenly curious about this stranger who'd appeared just when she needed someone most. "Actually, I'm here to stay, at least for a while," he replied. "Bought the old McCreary place last month. Been fixing it up before bringing in my herd." Pearl raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You're a rancher, starting to be," he confirmed. "Spent 10 years driving cattle for other men. Decided it was time to build something of my own." Their conversation was interrupted by a weak voice from the bed. "Is that you, Pearl dear?" Pearl moved quickly to Widow Lawson's side, relieved to see the older woman's eyes clearer than they had been when she'd arrived. "Yes, Mrs. Lawson. I've brought medicine from Dr. Fletcher. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," the older woman said with a weak attempt at humor. Her gaze moved past Pearl to where Garrett stood. "And who might this handsome young man be?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Pearl felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "This is Mr. North. He helped me get here when the bridge collapsed." Widow Lawson's eyes widened. "The bridge is gone. Lord have mercy." "Don't you worry about that now," Pearl soothed, helping the woman take a spoonful of the medicine. "You just focus on getting better." The storm raged outside for hours, trapping them all in the small cabin. Jacob eventually fell asleep in a chair by the fire, exhausted from worry and the long day. Pearl continued to tend to Mrs. Lawson, while Garrett kept the fire going and made a simple stew from supplies in the widow's pantry. It was near midnight when Mrs. Lawson finally fell into a peaceful sleep, her fever breaking at last. Pearl sagged with relief, the events of the day catching up with her as fatigue settled deep in her bones. "You should rest," Garrett said quietly, appearing at her side with another cup of tea. "You've been on your feet for hours." Pearl accepted the tea gratefully. "I should stay awake in case she needs something." "I'll keep watch," he offered. "I'm used to long nights on the trail." Pearl wanted to protest, but exhaustion was making her eyelids heavy. "Perhaps just for an hour," she conceded, settling into the other chair by the fire. She meant to stay awake, to sip her tea and perhaps learn more about this mysterious cowboy who had appeared in her life so dramatically. But the warmth of the fire, the rhythmic sound of the rain on the roof, and the bone-deep weariness soon pulled her into sleep. When Pearl awoke, weak sunlight was filtering through the cabin's small windows. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her neck felt so stiff. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back: the bridge, the fall, the strong hand gripping her wrist when all hope seemed lost. She sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Jacob was already up, quietly preparing breakfast. Mrs. Lawson was still asleep, her breathing deep and regular, her face no longer flushed with fever, but Garrett was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning, Miss Taylor," Jacob said when he noticed she was awake. Mr. North went to check on his horse and see about the damage from the storm. Pearl nodded, trying to ignore the strange disappointment she felt at not seeing Garrett's face first thing. It was foolish, she knew. He was a stranger who had done her a kindness, nothing more. She was helping Jacob prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush when the cabin door opened, and Garrett stepped inside, bringing with him the fresh scent of rain-washed earth. His clothes were still damp, his dark hair curling slightly at the ends, but his green eyes were bright and alert. "The storm's passed," he announced, removing his hat. "But I rode down to where the bridge was. It's gone completely, nothing left but a few posts on either side. It's going to take the whole town to build a new one." Pearl's heart sank. The bridge was the main connection between the town and the outlying homesteads. Without it, families like the Lawsons would be isolated, forced to take a much longer route around the gorge to reach Park City. "How will we get back to town?" she asked, the practical problem suddenly occurring to her. "There's an old hunting trail that follows the gorge south for about 3 miles before crossing at a narrower point," Garrett explained. "It's rough going, but Jupiter can manage it. I can take you back to town once you're ready." Mrs. Lawson stirred then, drawing Pearl's attention. The older woman was indeed much improved, her eyes clear and her voice stronger as she thanked Pearl for coming through the storm to help her. "It was the least I could do," Pearl said sincerely, "and it's Mr. North you should really thank. Without him, I wouldn't have made it across at all." Mrs. Lawson's knowing gaze moved between Pearl and Garrett, a small smile playing at her lips. "The Lord sends help when we need it most," she said simply, after ensuring that Mrs. Lawson was truly on the mend and that Jacob could manage her care for the next few days. Pearl prepared to depart. Garrett had already saddled Jupiter and was waiting outside when she emerged from the cabin. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her mount. Pearl nodded, suddenly shy in the bright light of day. The life-and-death intensity of their meeting had created an unusual intimacy between them, but now, in the mundane aftermath, she felt strangely vulnerable. Once again, she found herself seated before him on the horse, his arms around her as he guided Jupiter down the trail away from the Lawson cabin. The air was fresh and clean after the storm, the world washed new, and despite the destruction the weather had wrought, Pearl couldn't help but feel a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced in a long time. "You mentioned you teach at the school," Garrett said as they rode, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "How long have you been doing that?" "Almost 5 years now," Pearl replied, realizing with surprise that she'd never discussed her work at length with a man before. Most of the miners and merchants in Park City viewed her role as temporary, something to occupy her until she found a husband. I started helping the previous teacher when I was 18, and when she left to get married, I took over. You enjoy it? Teaching, I mean. The question was asked with genuine interest, and Pearl found herself warming to the topic. I do. Very much. The children here have so little, especially those from the mining families. Education is their best hope for a different life. Garrett was quiet for a moment, and Pearl wondered if she'd spoken too passionately. Then he said, "My mother was a teacher, back in Missouri. She used to say the same thing, that knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you once you had it." There was something in his voice, a mixture of pride and old sorrow, that made Pearl want to know more. "Is she still teaching?" "No," Garrett said softly. "She passed on when I was 16, influenza." "I'm sorry," Pearl said, meaning it. "My father died 3 years ago, mining accident." Garrett's arms tightened slightly around her, a gesture of understanding rather than romance, but it sent a small shiver through her nonetheless. "This country takes as much as it gives," he observed, his voice rumbling behind her. "Beautiful but harsh." Pearl nodded, gazing at the landscape around them. The trail they followed skirted the edge of the gorge for a while before veering into denser forest. The canyon walls were streaked with vibrant reds and oranges where the minerals in the rock caught the sunlight, while far below the stream glittered like a silver thread. "It is beautiful, though," she said. "I've never wanted to leave, even after Father died. Some people called me foolish for staying, but Park City is home." "Nothing foolish about knowing where you belong," Garrett replied. "Took me 10 years of wandering to figure that out myself." They fell into an easy conversation as they rode, with Garrett telling her about his years as a cattle driver, moving herds north from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, then later working as a ranch hand in Colorado. Pearl, in turn, shared stories of Park City's growth, the characters who populated the town, and her challenges teaching children of different ages and backgrounds in one small schoolhouse. By the time they reached the narrower crossing of the gorge, a natural stone bridge reinforced with rough-hewn logs, Pearl felt as though she'd known Garrett for years rather than hours. There was something refreshingly direct about him, a lack of pretense that made conversation flow easily. The return journey to Park City took nearly 3 hours longer than the direct route would have, and the sun was high overhead by the time the town came into view. Pearl was surprised to find herself reluctant for the journey to end. "Where should I take you?" Garrett asked as they approached the outskirts of town. "I live at the boarding house on Pine Street," Pearl replied. "But perhaps we should stop at the sheriff's office first to report what happened to the bridge." Garrett agreed, guiding Jupiter down the main street of Park City. The town was bustling with its usual activity, miners heading to or from their shifts, merchants calling out their wares, women going about their shopping or errands. Several people called out greetings to Pearl, their expressions curious at the sight of her riding double with a stranger. Sheriff Donovan was outside his office, whittling a piece of wood as they approached. He straightened up at the sight of them, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Miss Taylor, folks were starting to worry when you didn't return yesterday," he said, then eyed Garrett with suspicion. "Who's your friend?" Pearl quickly explained about the bridge collapse and Garrett's timely rescue, watching as the sheriff's expression shifted from suspicion to concern, and finally to grudging respect as he extended his hand to Garrett. "Seems we owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. North," Sheriff Donovan said. "That bridge has been needing replacement for years, but the town council's been dragging their feet on the expense." "They won't have much choice now," Garrett observed, "and I'd be happy to help with the rebuilding. I've some experience with that kind of work." The sheriff nodded. "I'll call a town meeting for tonight. We'll need to organize work parties and gather materials." He turned to Pearl. "Are the Lawsons all right out there?" "They're cut off now. Mrs. Lawson is recovering well, and they have supplies to last a while," Pearl assured him. "But we'll need to establish a way to reach them and the other families beyond the gorge until a new bridge can be built." After providing the sheriff with all the details he needed, Garrett escorted Pearl to the boarding house. As they reached the front porch, Pearl found herself suddenly shy again, unsure of the proper way to thank someone for saving your life. "Mr. North Garrett," she began, looking up at him as he stood holding Jupiter's reins. "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you did yesterday." Garrett's expression softened, those green eyes crinkling at the corners. "No thanks needed, Miss Taylor. Anyone would have done the same." "I don't believe that's true," Pearl replied honestly. "Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and new, tentative feelings. Finally, Garrett cleared his throat. "I wonder," he said, his tone carefully casual, "if you might allow me to call on you properly sometime, perhaps after the matter of the bridge is settled." Pearl felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her near-death experience the day before. "I would like that very much," she answered, a smile spreading across her face. Garrett's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then I'll look forward to it, Miss Taylor." "Pearl," she corrected him. "I think after dangling over Deadman's Gorge together, we can dispense with formalities." His laugh was warm and genuine. "Pearl it is, then." With a tip of his hat, Garrett mounted Jupiter and rode away, leaving Pearl standing on the porch with her heart beating a rhythm she hadn't felt before, a rhythm of possibility, and perhaps something more. The town meeting that evening was packed, with nearly every resident of Park City crowding into the meeting hall. Pearl sat with Mrs. Abernathy, the owner of the boarding house, listening as Sheriff Donovan explained the situation with the bridge. When he introduced Garrett as the man who had saved our schoolteacher from certain death, all eyes turned to Pearl, making her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Garrett, who stood at the back of the hall, merely nodded in acknowledgement of the sheriff's words, seeming uncomfortable with the attention. When discussion turned to rebuilding the bridge, however, he stepped forward with practical suggestions that impressed even the most skeptical of the town council members. "The man knows his business," Mrs. Abernathy whispered to Pearl, "and he's not hard on the eyes either." Pearl hushed her landlady, though privately she couldn't disagree. Throughout the meeting, she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Garrett, standing tall and steady amidst the crowd. Each time their eyes met, a small thrill ran through her, both familiar and entirely new. By the meeting's end, a plan had been established. Work parties would begin the very next day to clear the remains of the old bridge and prepare for construction of a new one. Supplies would be ordered from Salt Lake City, and in the meantime, a system of signals would be established to communicate with the families beyond the gorge in case of emergency. As the meeting dispersed, Pearl found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious townspeople eager to hear the details of her ordeal. By the time she extracted herself from the crowd, Garrett was nowhere to be seen. Disappointment settled in her chest, unexpectedly sharp, looking for someone. A deep voice asked from behind her. Pearl turned to find Garrett standing there, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to her, and their fingers brushed as she accepted it, sending a small jolt through her that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. "I thought you'd left," she admitted, taking a sip to hide her smile. "Without saying goodbye." "That would be poor manners," Garrett replied, his eyes twinkling. "Besides, I wanted to ask if you'd like to join me for dinner tomorrow evening." "I understand Hoskins' restaurant is the finest establishment in Park City." Pearl laughed. That's not saying much, but yes, it's the best we have. And yes, I would like that very much. They stood together outside the meeting hall, sipping their coffee as the townsfolk dispersed around them. The evening air was cool but pleasant, the stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Neither seemed in a hurry to part ways. "Tell me about your ranch," Pearl said, genuinely curious about the life he was building. "The old McCreary place has been empty for years." "It needs a lot of work." Garrett nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That it does. The house is solid enough, but the barn needs a new roof and the fencing is half gone in places. I've been working on it for weeks now, sleeping in the barn until the house is habitable." "Alone?" Pearl asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. It wasn't her place to inquire about his personal circumstances, but Garrett didn't seem to mind the question. "For now," he said simply. "I've hired 2 hands who'll arrive with the cattle next month. They're good men I've worked with before." The conversation flowed easily between them as they walked slowly back toward the boarding house. Garrett told her about his plans for the ranch, the breed of cattle he intended to raise, the improvements he wanted to make to the land, his hopes of eventually expanding if the venture proved successful. Pearl, in turn, shared her dreams for the school: more books, better equipment, perhaps even a second teacher one day as the town continued to grow. Garrett listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he valued her thoughts and ambitions. At the boarding house steps, they paused again, neither quite ready to end the evening. "I should let you rest," Garrett said finally. "It's been an eventful couple of days." Pearl nodded, though rest was the furthest thing from her mind at that moment. "Will you be helping with the bridge tomorrow?" "I will," he confirmed. "Sheriff Donovan asked me to lead one of the work parties." He hesitated, then added, "But I'll still call for you at 6 if that suits." "It does," Pearl said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "Good night, Garrett." "Good night, Pearl," he replied softly, taking her hand briefly in his before turning to leave. Pearl watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight of the main street. Only when he disappeared from view did she finally enter the boarding house, her mind still full of green eyes and the feeling of falling not into Deadman's Gorge this time, but into something far more dangerous and exhilarating. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for both Pearl and Garrett. During the days, Garrett worked tirelessly with the bridge construction crews, his experience and leadership quickly earning him the respect of the other men. Pearl continued her teaching duties, but also organized the town's women to provide meals for the work crews and helped coordinate supplies coming in from Salt Lake City. In the evenings, they began to carve out time for each other. Their first dinner at Hoskins' restaurant had led to a second, then walks through town, and eventually a Sunday afternoon picnic in the meadow above Park City. With each meeting, the connection between them deepened, moving beyond the intense circumstances of their first encounter into something more substantial and enduring. Pearl found herself charmed by Garrett's quiet strength, his integrity, and his dry sense of humor that emerged more frequently as they grew comfortable with each other. He, in turn, was drawn to her intelligence, her dedication to her students, and the gentle determination that allowed her to make her own way in a town where most women her age were already wives and mothers. 3 weeks after the bridge collapse, the new structure was nearly complete, stronger and wider than its predecessor, built to withstand the harsh Utah weather for decades to come. The project had brought the community together, creating a bond between the townsfolk and the families beyond the gorge that hadn't existed before. It had also firmly established Garrett as a respected member of the community. His willingness to work alongside men of all stations, His practical knowledge and his fair dealings had won him friends throughout Park City. Even Mrs. Abernathy, who viewed most men with suspicion, had declared him a proper gentleman, despite those cowboy boots. On the evening before the bridge was to be officially opened, Garrett invited Pearl to ride out to his ranch. "I've finally got the house in livable condition," he explained as they rode double on Jupiter, heading out of town along the mountain trail. "I'd value your opinion on it." The sun was beginning its descent as they crested the hill overlooking the McCreary North property. Pearl drew in a breath at the view. The ranch house sat in a small valley protected by mountains on 3 sides, with a creek running through the lush pastureland. The house itself was modest but sturdy, with a newly repaired porch wrapping around 2 sides. Nearby stood a large barn, its new roof gleaming in the late afternoon light, and corrals that hadn't existed when Garrett purchased the property. "It's beautiful," Pearl said honestly. "You've accomplished so much in such a short time." Garrett's arms tightened briefly around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "There's still much to do before the cattle arrive, but it's starting to feel like home." They dismounted, and Garrett led her on a tour of the property, showing her the improvements he'd made and explaining his plans for the future. Inside the house, Pearl was surprised to find not the bare bachelor quarters she'd expected, but a home taking shape. The main room had been freshly whitewashed, with simple but well-made furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. Curtains hung at the windows, clearly a recent addition, and shelves had been built along one wall. "Did you make these?" Pearl asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of a bookshelf. Garrett nodded. "Carpentry was my father's trade. He taught me before I left home." He hesitated, then added, "Hoped you might help me fill those shelves someday. Books were always in short supply on the trail." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Pearl turned to face him fully, finding him watching her with an expression of quiet hope and vulnerability that made her heart ache with tenderness. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Garrett took a step toward her, then stopped as if uncertain of his welcome. Pearl closed the distance between them, her hand rising of its own accord to touch his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the stubble of his beard rough but not unpleasant. "Pearl," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. When I saw you on that bridge about to fall, something in me knew that if I lost you, I'd be losing something I hadn't even found yet." Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes at his words, so honest and unadorned. "I felt it too," she whispered. "Even in that moment of terror when you grabbed my wrist, I knew you were someone important, someone I was meant to know." Garrett's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew those hands possessed. "May I kiss you?" he asked, the formality of the question at odds with the raw emotion in his eyes. Instead of answering, Pearl rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, almost reverent, but quickly deepened into something more passionate as Garrett's arms encircled her, drawing her against the solid warmth of his chest. Pearl felt herself responding with an intensity that might have frightened her had it been anyone else. But with Garrett, it felt right, as if a part of her had been waiting for precisely this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, the sun had dipped below the mountains, casting the room in the golden glow of dusk. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I should take you back to town," he said reluctantly. "Before it gets dark." Pearl nodded, though leaving was the last thing she wanted to do. As if reading her thoughts, Garrett smiled ruefully. "I want to do right by you, Pearl, court you properly, with the respect you deserve." His old-fashioned gallantry touched her deeply. "You're a good man, Garrett North," she said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "And yes, you should take me back, but I'll be thinking of this moment until I see you again." The ride back to Park City was quieter than the journey out, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with shared glances and the occasional touch of Garrett's hand on hers. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Pearl found herself naming constellations as they rode, sharing the knowledge her father had taught her years ago. At the boarding house, Garrett helped her dismount, holding her perhaps a moment longer than necessary before releasing her. "Tomorrow is the bridge dedication," he said. "Would you do me the honor of attending with me?" Pearl smiled up at him. "I would be proud to." He bent to kiss her once more, a brief but tender gesture that left her lips tingling. "Good night, Pearl." "Good night," she replied, watching as he mounted Jupiter and rode away, his silhouette soon swallowed by the darkness. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting in the parlor, her knitting needles clicking away though her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Had a nice evening, did you?" she asked, her tone innocent though her expression was knowing. "Very nice, thank you," Pearl replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. The older woman nodded sagely. "He's a keeper, that one. Not like those fly-by-night miners or those fancy merchants who think they're too good for a frontier town. A man who builds things means to stay." Pearl didn't dispute the assessment as she climbed the stairs to her room. The thought of Garrett staying of building a life in Park City filled her with a warm glow that accompanied her into her dreams. The bridge dedication the following day was a community celebration. Practically, the entire town turned out, along with the families from beyond the gorge who were finally reunited with the main settlement. Tables laden with food lined the area near the bridge, children ran about playing games, and someone had even brought a fiddle to provide music for dancing later. Pearl stood proudly beside Garrett as Mayor Henderson cut the ribbon stretched across the new bridge. When the mayor called Garrett forward to say a few words about the construction, Pearl felt her heart swell with pride at the respectful silence that fell over the crowd. "This bridge represents more than just a crossing over Deadman's Gorge," Garrett said, his deep voice carrying easily to the assembled townsfolk. "It represents the strength of this community, the way you all come together in times of need. I may be new to Park City, but in these past weeks, I've seen the true character of this place. It's not the silver in your mines that makes this town valuable, it's the people who call it home." A cheer went up at his words, and Pearl found herself blinking back tears. When Garrett returned to her side, she squeezed his hand, too moved to speak. The celebration continued into the evening, with lanterns strung around the area casting a magical glow over the proceedings. Pearl and Garrett danced together as the fiddle player struck up a lively tune, their bodies moving in perfect harmony despite having never danced together before. "You dance well for a cowboy," Pearl teased as he guided her expertly through a turn. Garrett grinned down at her. "My mother insisted I learn, said no son of hers would clod around a dance floor like a bear with sore feet." Pearl laughed, imagining the scene. "I wish I could have met her. She would have loved you," Garrett said with such certainty that Pearl's heart skipped a beat. As the music shifted to a slower tune, Garrett drew her closer, his hand warm against the small of her back. They swayed together, the rest of the celebration seeming to fade into the background as they moved in their own private world. "Pearl," Garrett said softly, his breath stirring the tendrils of hair near her ear. "There's something I need to ask you." Pearl looked up at him, her pulse quickening at the serious tone in his voice. "Yes." Garrett guided her away from the dancing area to a quieter spot near the edge of the gorge. The new bridge stretched before them, solid and strong against the darkening sky. "I know it hasn't been long," he began, taking both her hands in his. "And if you think it's too soon, I'll understand. But I've lived enough of my life to know when something is right, and this us is the most right thing I've ever known." Pearl felt her breath catch as Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. When he dropped to one knee before her, she couldn't hold back a small gasp. "Pearl Taylor," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You've brought light and joy into my life in ways I never expected. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a ring with a small but perfect pearl set in gold, flanked by tiny diamonds that caught the lantern light and reflected it like stars. Tears filled Pearl's eyes as she looked from the beautiful ring to the even more beautiful man kneeling before her. In that moment, she saw not just the present but a future unfolding, a life built together day by day with all its joys and challenges. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Garrett North, I will marry you." Joy blazed across his face as he stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then his arms were around her, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that drew cheers and applause from nearby celebrants who had witnessed the proposal. When he set her down, Garrett kissed her deeply, seemingly oblivious to their audience. Pearl returned the kiss with equal fervor, her heart so full she thought it might burst with happiness. "I love you," Garrett said against her lips, the first time he'd spoken the words aloud, though she'd felt them in 100 different ways. "And I love you," Pearl replied, the declaration both a culmination and a beginning. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the celebration, resulting in a steady stream of well-wishers offering congratulations. Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, mumbling about young love, while simultaneously informing Pearl that she'd have to find a new boarder now. Sheriff Donovan offered a gruff congratulations and warned Garrett to treat her right, while Widow Lawson, fully recovered and attending with Jacob, declared it was Providence that had brought them together. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Garrett and Pearl walked hand in hand across the new bridge, pausing at the midpoint to look down at the gorge below. "Hard to believe it was just 3 weeks ago," Pearl mused, her free hand unconsciously reaching for the railing, secure in its newness. Garrett followed her gaze to the jagged rocks below. "I still dream about it sometimes," he admitted quietly. "About being a moment too late, about not reaching you in time." Pearl turned to him, touched by the vulnerability in his admission. "But you did reach me. You saved me." Garrett's fingers tightened around hers. "I think perhaps we saved each other." As they stood there, with the stars shining above and their future stretching before them as solid and promising as the bridge beneath their feet, Pearl knew he was right. The rope had snapped, she had fallen, and he had caught her not just physically in that terrifying moment over Deadman's Gorge, but in all the ways that mattered, all the ways that would continue to matter for the rest of their lives together. The wedding took place 2 months later, in early July, when the mountain wildflowers were at their peak. Pearl had insisted on waiting until the ranch was fully operational and Garrett's cattle had arrived, wanting their new life together to start on solid footing. Garrett had respected her practicality, while admitting with a grin that he would have married her the day after she accepted his proposal if she'd been willing. The ceremony was held outdoors, at a spot overlooking the ranch where the view of the mountains was most spectacular. Nearly the entire town turned out for the occasion, along with the families from beyond the gorge who had come to think of Garrett as their champion after his work on the bridge. Pearl wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Abernathy and several other women from town had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once belonged to her mother. Her bouquet was a cascade of wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadows around the ranch. Garrett, standing tall and proud beside Reverend Wallace, looked more handsome than Pearl had ever seen him in a new black suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. But it was the look in his eyes as she walked toward him that Pearl would remember forever, a look of such pure love and wonder that it brought tears to her eyes. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Wallace began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Pearl and Garrett had written their own vows, promises spoken with clear voices and unwavering conviction. When Garrett slipped a gold band to accompany her engagement ring, his fingers trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the emotion Pearl could see plainly in his eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Wallace declared at last. "Mr. North, you may kiss your bride." Garrett didn't hesitate, drawing Pearl into his arms for a kiss that managed to be both properly respectful given their audience and deeply passionate. When they turned to face the assembled guests, now officially introduced as Mr. and Mrs. North, the cheer that went up seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. The celebration that followed was joyous and relaxed, with tables set up in the yard near the ranch house, food abundant, and music provided by a small band of local musicians. Pearl danced with her new husband until her feet ached, then kicked off her shoes and danced some more, unwilling to let go of a moment of this perfect day. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the continuing festivities. Pearl found herself momentarily alone as Garrett spoke with some of his ranch hands, ensuring all was in order for the next day. She stood at the edge of the yard, looking out over the land that was now her home, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle in her bones. "Happy, Mrs. North?" a voice asked beside her, and Pearl turned to find Mrs. Abernathy, a glass of punch in her hand and a rare soft expression on her normally stern face. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Pearl replied honestly. The older woman nodded in satisfaction. "Good. You deserve it, my dear." "And so does he." She glanced over to where Garrett stood, his tall figure easily visible among the guests. "Not many men would have risked their lives for a stranger the way he did for you. That tells you everything you need to know about his character." Pearl followed her gaze, warmth spreading through her at the sight of her husband. "It does," she agreed, "though I've learned so much more about him since then." "As you should," Mrs. Abernathy said approvingly. "Marriage isn't built on grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It's built day by day, in the quiet moments and the ordinary tasks done together." She patted Pearl's hand affectionately. "But it doesn't hurt to have a good story to tell your grandchildren someday." Pearl laughed at that, though the thought of children, of building a family with Garrett, filled her with a sweet anticipation. They had discussed it, of course, both agreeing they wanted children, though Pearl planned to continue teaching for as long as she could. Garrett had fully supported this, even suggesting they might eventually build a small schoolhouse on the ranch property for the children of neighboring homesteads as well as their own. As the evening progressed, guests began to depart, calling out final congratulations and well wishes. Eventually, only a few close friends remained, helping to clear away the remnants of the celebration before taking their leave. Finally, Pearl and Garrett stood alone in the yard, the lantern still glowing softly around them. "Mrs. North," Garrett said, drawing her into his arms, "how does it feel?" "Wonderful," Pearl replied, smiling up at him, "though I might need some time to get used to the name." "We have all the time in the world," Garrett assured her, bending to kiss her softly. When he pulled back, His expression was tender but with an undercurrent of desire that made Pearl's pulse quicken. "Shall we go inside? To our home?" Pearl nodded, suddenly shy despite the weeks of anticipation leading to this moment. Garrett seemed to understand, his hand gentle as he led her toward the house that would now be theirs together. Inside, he had prepared a surprise. The main room was illuminated by candlelight, with fresh flowers arranged in vases on the mantel and tables. The bookshelves that had once been empty were now half filled with volumes, some that Pearl recognized from her own small collection, others that were new. "When did you do all this?" she asked, touched by the thought and care he had put into making their home beautiful for her. "I had some help," Garrett admitted with a smile. "Mrs. Abernathy and Widow Lawson came out yesterday while you were in town finishing your dress." Pearl turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail. Then her eyes fell on a framed photograph on the mantel that hadn't been there before, a portrait of a handsome couple, the woman with Garrett's eyes, the man with his strong jawline. "Your parents?" she asked softly. Garrett nodded, coming to stand beside her. "I've carried that with me everywhere. It's the only thing I have left of them." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I wanted them here in a way to be part of our beginning." Pearl leaned into him, her heart full. "They would be so proud of the man you've become." Garrett's arm tightened around her. "I hope so," he said simply. They stood together for a long moment, the silence between them comfortable and intimate. Then Garrett turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I have one more surprise," he said, his expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement that intrigued her. "Another one." "Garrett, you've already done so much." He shook his head. "This one's different." He led her to the bookshelf and reached behind a row of books, withdrawing a leather-bound journal. "I started writing this the day after we met. I wanted to remember everything, every conversation, every moment together, how I felt when I saw you standing in the sunlight or laughing with your students." Pearl accepted the journal with trembling hands, deeply moved by the unexpected gift. "May I?" she asked, and at his nod she carefully opened it. The pages were filled with Garrett's bold handwriting, describing their time together from his perspective. Some entries were brief, just a line or two about a shared meal or a walk through town. Others were longer, delving into his thoughts and feelings as their relationship deepened. The honesty and vulnerability displayed in those pages brought tears to Pearl's eyes. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me," she said, when she could find her voice again. "To see our story through your eyes." Garrett took the journal gently from her hands and placed it on a nearby table. Then he cupped her face in his palms, his expression so tender it made her heart ache. "Our story is just beginning, Pearl," he said softly. "And I intend to fill many more journals over the years we'll share together." Then he kissed her, a kiss different from any they had shared before, deeper, more intimate, a promise of the night to come and all the days and nights that would follow. Pearl responded with equal passion, any remaining shyness melting away in the heat of their embrace. Later, much later, as they lay together in the moonlight filtering through the bedroom window, Pearl traced her fingers over Garrett's chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. Pearl smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I was thinking about fate, about how something as terrible as a bridge collapsing could lead to something so wonderful." Garrett caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "I don't know if it was fate or providence or just blind luck that put me on that trail at that exact moment," he said thoughtfully. "But I do know I'd cross 1,000 broken bridges to find my way to you." The years that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of building a life together. The ranch prospered under Garrett's careful management, eventually growing to be one of the most successful in the territory. Pearl continued teaching in town for 2 years, until the arrival of their first child, a son they named James, after Garrett's father made the daily journey impractical. True to their discussions before marriage, Garrett helped Pearl establish a small schoolhouse on their property, where she taught not only their own children but those of neighboring homesteads and ranch hands as well. Her reputation as an educator grew, and eventually the county school board asked for her input on curriculum for all the schools in the region. Their family grew with the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years after James, and another son, Thomas, 3 years later. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, growing strong and capable under the loving guidance of both parents. The bridge over Deadman's Gorge became something of a local landmark, known for its sturdy construction and the romance associated with it. Garrett and Pearl made a tradition of walking across it on the anniversary of their first meeting, sometimes alone, sometimes with their children, always pausing at the midpoint to remember the moment that had changed both their lives forever. 10 years after their wedding, as they stood on that spot with their 3 children running ahead of them on the bridge, Pearl looked up at her husband, seeing the same love in his eyes that had been there from the beginning, deepened now by shared experiences, challenges overcome together, and the day-to-day building of a life that was richer and more fulfilling than either had imagined possible. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question she posed every year on this day. Garrett's answer was always the same, spoken with absolute certainty as he drew her close. "Not a single one." As they watched their children's laughter and antics against the backdrop of the mountains, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The rope had snapped, she had fallen, and Garrett had caught her. But what had begun as a dramatic rescue had become something far more profound, a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and unwavering commitment. In the years to come, there would be more challenges, droughts that threatened the ranch, illnesses that brought fear, the inevitable conflicts that arise in any marriage. But through it all, Pearl and Garrett would face life together, their bond strengthened by each obstacle overcome, each joy shared. And whenever the path seemed uncertain, they would remember that moment on the bridge, the terror of falling, the strength of the hand that caught her, and the profound truth they had discovered together. That sometimes, when we are most at risk of losing everything, we find exactly what we need to hold onto for the rest of our lives.